Scouthead sits on high ground above Oldham, on the western edge of the Pennines, where the moorland begins to open out and the terraced rows of the mill towns thin into something looser and more scattered. It's not a large place, and in 1972 it was not a large place either. A cluster of stone buildings along Huddersfield Road, a church, a few pubs, the kind of settlement where the same families had lived for generations and where a newcomer was still a newcomer after 20 years. It was the kind of community where children walked to school and stopped on the way home, where the same faces appeared in the same places at the same times, week after week, year after year, where the corner shop was not simply a convenience, but a fixed point in the daily life of the village, a place that had been there as long as most people could remember, run by a woman most people had known since childhood. Her name was Margaret Potts. People called her Ma Potts. I'm your host Susan, and this is Manchester Murders episode 21. The murder of Margaret Potts and the half-century of consequences that followed from one night in December 1972. Margaret Potts was 74 years old. She'd run the small shop on Huddersfield Road for many years, long enough that the children who called in for sweets on their way home from Dr. Lane's school had grown up, left Scouthead and come back to raise children of their own who made the same stop. She sold the things a village shop sells: basics, small pleasures, the penny arrow bars and halfpenny Spanishes that were the particular currency of childhood in that time and place. She knew her customers, and they knew her. The word that came up when people in Scouthead remembered her, decades later, was grand. A grand and kind lady. She was also, in the autumn of 1972, contending with something that had unsettled shopkeepers and customers across the country. Decimalisation had come in less than 2 years earlier, on the 15th of February 1971. What the government had branded D-Day, with a public information campaign, a Max Bygrave song, and an ITV drama called Granny Gets the Point, in which an elderly woman who couldn't understand the new system was patiently taught it by her grandson. The state understood at some level where the difficulty would fall. Elderly people found the changeover harder than most. The old money, pounds, shillings, pence, the elaborate arithmetic of farthings and half-crowns and sixpences, had been in use for centuries. The phrase that attached itself to those who struggled with the conversion was pointed enough. How much is that in real money? For a woman who had run a village sweet shop since at least the late 1950s, who had spent decades counting out penny arrow bars and halfpenny Spanishes in a system she knew in her bones, the new coins and the new prices were a genuine disruption. A penny in the old money had been worth 2.4 new pence. The halfpenny sweet was now, notionally, worth just over a fifth of a new penny, a fraction that made no practical sense at a counter where children handed over coins and expected change. Local people who remembered Mrs. Potts in those months recalled her struggling. The familiar calculations no longer worked. The coins in the till were different. Concerns had been raised before decimalisation that elderly and rural shopkeepers in particular would be disadvantaged by the change, that they were the ones least likely to adapt quickly and most likely to find themselves confused in front of customers. Margaret Potts was not unique in her difficulty, but in December 1972, with the old currency barely gone 20 months, she was still finding it hard to keep up. The shop sat more or less opposite the Star Inn on Huddersfield Road. Small, stone-built, the sort of premises that doubled as home and business. The front given over to goods and customers, back where she actually lived. The details that matter in what followed are ordinary details. The location of the shop, the familiarity of the customers, the fact that she was known, and the fact that she was alone. On the evening of the 15th of December 1972, a 16-year-old boy left a pub in Oldham. He'd been drinking, he decided to go to Mrs. Potts' shop on the way home. Roy Norman Kenyon was from Dobcross, a village just a short walk away, close enough that he knew the area, knew the shop, knew its owner. What he intended when he walked through the door is not entirely clear from the surviving record. What happened once he was inside left Margaret Potts dead, and Kenyon eventually convicted of her murder. The accounts differ slightly on the precise trigger. The formal court record, as reported in the Irish High Court proceedings nearly 50 years later, says that Kenyon got into an argument with Mrs. Potts and struck her twice in the head with a poker while she sat in an armchair. Local memory in Scouthead, passed down in the community and recalled in conversations long after the event, adds a detail not captured in the legal record: that Kenyon had been caught pilfering from the shop, stealing sweets. And it was this that began the confrontation. It's possible both accounts are true. It's possible that the decimalisation confusion, the difficulty over prices and change that people remembered Mrs. Potts struggling with in those months, played into whatever argument developed. What the physical evidence established beyond dispute was the outcome. She was beaten to death with the poker. The force of the attack was considerable. Her daughter, Irene, would later say that when the police arrived that night, they had held her back from entering the shop. She said her mother would have been unrecognisable. Margaret Potts was 74 years old. She'd run her shop for decades. She was sitting in her armchair. She knew the boy who came through the door. Roy Kenyon was arrested and tried. He was convicted of murder. Because he had been 16 at the time of the offence, a minor under the law, he could not receive the sentence that would have applied to an adult. Instead, he received what the law prescribed for children convicted of murder: detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. The phrase carries a formality that can obscure what it actually means. It has its roots in the literal power of the Crown to detain subjects, a reach of royal authority that, in practice, had long since passed to government officials and parole bodies. What it meant for a 16-year-old convicted of murder in 1972 was this: there was no minimum term. There was no date to count toward. There was no sentence in the conventional sense. No number of years to serve after which release would follow automatically. Instead, there was a process of periodic review. The parole board would assess whether he was safe to release. Until they were satisfied, he would remain inside. Until they were satisfied, the sentence had no end. The sentence had originally been intended to acknowledge something real: that a child offender is different from an adult, that development continues, that the person who commits a murder at 16 may be a different person at 25 or 35, and that indefinite detention offers, at least in theory, the possibility of release once rehabilitation is established. In practice, as those held under the sentence discovered, the absence of a fixed endpoint was not straightforwardly more lenient than a tariff. It was, in many cases, considerably harder to bear. There was no certainty. There was no moment at which the time owed could be declared paid. Release depended on the judgment of a board reviewing a risk that, by its nature, could never be entirely disproved. Roy Kenyon began to serve that sentence. What happened over the following decades is, in some respects, a separate story from the murder itself, but it is the story that shaped what the case became and what it meant to those left behind. The 70s and 80s passed. Kenyon remained in custody. By his own account, and by the account later put before an Irish court by his barrister, he had been considered eligible for release in the 80s, when he had completed what the law describes as the punitive portion of his sentence, the element that exists to punish rather than to protect. But release had not followed. The parole board, conducting the reviews that the indeterminate sentence required, had not been satisfied. He went before the board 6 times. Each time, he remained inside. Then, in September 1990, he absconded. He was being held at Sudbury Prison, an open establishment in Derbyshire. The kind of facility that represents progression through the prison system, lower security, a step toward the outside. He left, but he was caught before he could leave the country and was returned. As his barrister would later tell a court in Dublin, when a prisoner absconds and is returned, they go back to the bottom of what the system calls the penal ladder. Progress accumulated over years is reset. The trust required for open conditions is withdrawn. Kenyon was in the process of having his sentence reviewed again, edging once more towards the possibility of release, when in May 2003 he failed to return from home leave. He'd been held at Layhill Prison, another open establishment, this time in Gloucestershire. He did not come back. He'd been in prison for 31 years, and this time he did not stay in the country. Roy Kenyon crossed to Ireland and settled in Tullamore in County Offaly, in the Irish Midlands. He lived there under a false name, Alan Macpherson. He built, by the available accounts, an ordinary life, the kind of life that is invisible precisely because it is ordinary. He was not, as far as anyone could establish, a danger to those around him. He had no further criminal convictions. He lived quietly in a town where nobody knew who he was or what he'd done 30 years earlier in a village shop on a moor above Oldham. The years accumulated. 5 years, 10, 15. Back in Scouthead, the shop where Margaret Potts had died was gone, changed into a house. And the community had changed too. But Irene Domain, Margaret's daughter, had not stopped thinking about where Roy Kenyon was. In 2011, on the 40th anniversary of her mother's death, Irene spoke to the Oldham Chronicle. The police, she said, were stepping up their search. She urged them on. Her words were direct and unambiguous. Murder is murder, and life is life. He's still on the run after all this time, and he should be caught now to serve the rest of his life in prison. She said she felt that inquiries were being shoved under the carpet, and she could not understand why there had been no news. She once again described the night police had held her back from entering the shop. She'd carried that image for 40 years. Irene did not live to see what happened next. On the 2nd of May, 2018, Roy Kenyon was arrested in the village of Irene in County Cork, on the far southwestern coast of Ireland, a long way from Tullamore. He was 64 years old and had been living under his alias for 15 years. A European arrest warrant had been issued for his return to the United Kingdom. The Irish High Court proceedings that followed were themselves a substantial legal case. Kenyon's barrister, Sean Guerin SC, argued against his extradition, on grounds that engaged directly with the nature of his original sentence and the arc of his life since. The court heard that Kenyon was a child offender, 16 at the time of the murder, sentenced under the provisions that applied specifically to minors. His barrister described it as an exceptional state of affairs, that a child offender had spent 31 years in custody, and that almost 50 years later there remained a desire to return him to custody. He argued that Kenyon had not reoffended during the 15 years he'd lived freely in Ireland, that there was no professional evidence of risk to the public, and that returning him would subject him to an indeterminate sentence with no clear endpoint, what he described as a twilight zone of reviews and conditions and uncertainty repeated every 2 years. The state's position, presented by Ronan Kennedy BL, was equally clear. Kenyon had made a conscious decision to become a fugitive at the moment when his sentence was being reviewed. The fact that he had lived peaceably in Ireland did not change what he had done, or the fact that he had never been assessed and cleared for release by those whose job it was to make that judgment. This was not his first absconsion. He had absconded before, been caught, and been returned. The parole process had never been completed. Ms. Justice Eileen Donnelly rejected Kenyon's objections. She found that it was not egregious in law or in conscience to require a person sentenced as a child for murder to return to serve the remainder of that sentence. She noted that Kenyon's detention in the United Kingdom had at all times been the result of parole hearings assessing risk to the public, not arbitrary confinement. She noted that his behaviour, both in absconding twice and in his apparent desire to remain unmonitored, raised concerns rather than resolved them. On the 3rd of May 2019, she made the order for his surrender to the United Kingdom within 25 days. He was returned. What happened after that, whether he remains in custody, whether he has since been released on parole, is not a matter of public record. His case, like many that proceed through the parole system, disappears from view. The question of whether Roy Kenyon is still imprisoned or living freely somewhere in Britain cannot be answered from what is publicly known. There are cases that close and cases that don't. The criminal law in this one reached its conclusion in 1972. A conviction, a sentence, the mechanism of justice set in motion. But the sentence itself refused to close. It extended across decades, across abscondings and recaptures, and an extradition hearing in a Dublin courtroom, into a legal argument about the rights of a man who had been a child when he killed and was an old man now. Irene Domain spent more than 40 years wanting Kenyon to face the consequences she believed he had evaded. She did not live to see him extradited. She died with the question of where he was still unanswered. And Margaret Potts, the woman at the centre of it all, is the figure who recedes most easily into the long story of what followed. The legal proceedings of 2018 and 2019 were primarily about Kenyon, his rights, his risk, his history, his future. Her name appears as context, and the fact that established the original sentence. She's described accurately and with some care as an elderly shopkeeper. What those words don't capture is what the people of Scouthead remembered. A woman who had sold sweets to their parents and to them, and had been there, a fixture of the village, for as long as anyone could recall. Grand and kind. Margaret Potts, a 74-year-old woman sitting in her armchair who knew the boy who came through the door. Thank you for listening to Manchester Murders. Additional information on this case is available at our website, manchestermurders.com. Please do leave us a rating and review on your platform of choice. It makes a genuine difference to spreading the word. Until next time, stay safe.